Welcome to this lesson on War Photographer by Carolyn Duffy. I'm not the biggest fan of Duffy really, but I actually love this poem and it made me like her a lot more. And I do really agree with most of her messages, her thematic statements in the poem. So even if you generally aren't that into Duffy, this is a good Duffy poem, in my opinion. I found it's really kind of sensitive and clever and quite thoughtful in quite a different way about how we engage with war. So the best way to understand poems is to always think about them on the level of the themes and the messages that they're sending, and then work backwards and be able to analyze after you've really got to grips with those themes and messages. So I'll help you mostly with that in the lesson today. But the main idea, I think, is that in the modern world, we're really removed in our kind of privileged positions of not having to live through an immediate conflict. Most of us, we're really removed from what it feels like to be in a situation of war and how it must really affect or impact those who are in that kind of situation. We have a very distanced perspective from that. And she's trying to explore that through the idea of the photographer and then the media, and then finally how we receive the images that the photographer takes. So if you haven't read the poem recently and you want to refresh, I recommend pausing me and just reading it aloud to yourself now. It's good to read it aloud if you haven't already as well, because that always gives you kind of notice different things from if you read it just on a page. And all poetry is really meant to be read aloud as well. So yeah, pause me and come back once you've read the poem. And if you're happy to continue, we're going to jump into the vocab. So the main vocab thing that I feel like I have to explain with this one is the dark room. A dark room is not just a room that is black, it's a room specifically used to develop photographs. So before we had digital photographs, all photographs had to be processed on a reel of film that if it touched light, it would just be destroyed. Like the images that it captured wouldn't work. So the whole thing about the film reel is you have to process that entire thing in a non-light space until the image is fully formed, and then you can see the picture. So it's a lot slower than just taking a picture on your phone. But there's something kind of interesting about the process of it as well. I've always quite wanted to do it and never actually ever been in a darkroom or developed my own photographs. But yeah, the main idea behind it is that there's a low red light in your dark room. So it's not black, as you might imagine. It's kind of this quite red, quite creepy light. Quite often in old horror films, dark rooms get used as a quite intense setting. I was watching The Omen the other day, and there's a photographer who develops images in a dark room in that as well. So there's a low red light, and you want to think of the space that the photographer's in as this kind of dark red space, and the red is really significant. It's symbolic, and you can analyze that as well. The photographer is described or compared in a simile to a priest preparing to intone a mass. So intone just means deliver a speech, but in quite a flat tone, as if you're never changing, like going up and down with your intonation. A mass is a ceremony. So if you're Catholic, you probably know what this is, but if you're not Christian or not Catholic Christian, you might not have heard of it before. So it's basically, sorry to anyone who is Catholic if I'm describing it wrong, but this is kind of how I see what a mass is anyway. It's a ceremony of worship where Catholics receive the Eucharist. So the Eucharist is eating a wafer biscuit and drinking wine, which represents symbolically the body and blood of Christ. So this idea of spirituality and connection to God or kind of higher powers is present in the poem. When I was reading other analyses about this poem as well, because it's good to always read a range of other people's thoughts as well as your own on a poem, which is obviously why you're here. Well done. But yeah, if you read other people's ideas, it kind of jogs your memory, or it gives you different angles into the poem as well yourself. And when I was reading about it, someone suggested that it would be a funeral service, this type of mass that they're referencing. So the idea of a funeral service is obviously again linked to this context of war. The word agonies means feelings of extreme pain, but it's quite unusual because she pluralizes it. She uses the plural. Normally we hear that word in the singular, agony, like someone might say to you, I'm in agony, if they stub their toe or something like that. It means really intense pain. So it's already hard to deal with this word in the singular because it's so impactful, like emotional. But then she pluralizes it, so she makes it into agonies, plural, lots of people all feeling this feeling of extreme pain. So it's really difficult to get kind of that balance between the personal and the collective. So this sense that what happens to one individual is amplified and multiplied across all these different geographical locations, these different cultures, these different groups of people who are all suffering because of the idea of war, because of the theme and concept of war. So that's really central to the kind of message of the poem, as we'll see in a second. The word impassively means not showing any feelings or emotions. Spool is a circular device that holds film. So basically a kind of, like I was saying, when you have a photograph in olden days, it comes out on a reel, which is like a strip of material where it's recorded, and that gets wound into a spool, so like a circular kind of shape. I'm not really explaining it very well, but hopefully you know what a spool is. Easiest way is do like a Google image search. So if you're like, what is she on about? Just quickly Google image search so that you know. So yeah, we record film and photography on spools, or on film that then goes onto spools. So Sunday's supplement, the final one, is an idea that you've got this, when people get the news, they get the news every day and it gets delivered to them and they read it in the morning. My gran does this. People don't do it as much now because they read online on their phone and so on. But newspapers used to be really paper based in this day, but also kind of throwaway paper based. So yeah, like my gran, for example, she just gets the news in the morning, she reads the paper, and then by midday she's read everything and then she throws it away. And that's kind of how people used to consume news and media back in the day before the internet. And you get a supplement. So a supplement is like an extra little magazine on Sunday that goes alongside the normal general paper that you read. And it's just full of extra detail, or it might have special topics for that week. And it's a form of light entertainment, usually, the Sunday supplement. So she's making a point here that these horrific images of war are just appearing in a supplement, not even the real newspaper, just something kind of extra that's added on to the Sunday news. People read it and they consume it and they throw it away very quickly. So it's important that the difference between the reality of war and then the way that we experience or hear about war, and how safe we are when we're experiencing that. So we're going to go through the summary of the story now. I'm just going to do it stanza by stanza because I think there's quite a lot of detail in these stanzas, so it's good to kind of make sure that you know what's going on. The first one, we see the photographer and he's in his darkroom developing photos, and he puts them in rows as he's looking through them. He's compared to a priest preparing to intone a mass, because you've got this sense of the fact that he's picking and choosing what topics he's going to show. So in the same way, a priest might pick and choose what topics he's going to deliver in his speech to the congregation. We have the sense of picking and choosing which images you're going to show of this idea of war that you're trying to communicate to people. The final line has compressed and kind of almost random cities in it that were sites of war. So we have Belfast in Ireland, we have Beirut in Lebanon, and we have Phnom Penh in Cambodia. The wars in these places are completely not linked at all, and they're all kind of lumped together, and they also happen at different time periods as well, some of them. So she's compressing all these war events into this singular space, because that's sort of the experience that the photographer has. He's been to all these places, he's took all these pictures, and now he's just got random pictures of people dying and suffering from all these different locations. So for him, it's kind of like all the same. It's all part of his job, which is quite depressing, I suppose, if you think about it that way. But it's also the way that we experience it. I mean, would you, if you saw, a conflict from someone in, I don't know, say Belfast was at war, your reaction wouldn't really be that different from if Beirut was at war, probably. If you saw these pictures, you'd think, oh, what a poor person, or poor country, or feel sorry for them, or that's horrible. But your reaction's kind of similar regardless of what the war is. So she's talking about the feeling of war and the state of war, not individual personal specifics of any one war, which is really important when you're analysing her, because a lot of war poetry is really specific and it's about one particular conflict or one individual soldier, something like that. And this is not, it's universal. It's really zoomed out, and it's about the state of war in general and how we consume ideas about war. The final line comments that all flesh is grass, which is also a biblical phrase from the Bible, but it reminds us that human life is transient. So it's quite a sort of almost like throwaway message that we're all going to die anyway. That's the kind of feeling behind that phrase. So in stanza 2, we're told more information on the photographer. She reinforces that this is just a job that he does, as anyone would just, his approach to his job is the same as anyone's approach to any job that they do, which seems very impersonal and emotional. And it's interesting to explore that as well. You can think about, is that because you really have to be? There's no way that you could be a hyper emotional person and a war photographer, because it's so intense what you have to deal with all the time. You have to somehow learn to distance yourself. Or is it because the modern world or the developed world or the non-war-torn countries of the world are so safe that, it doesn't matter to them, this kind of conflict? So getting alternative interpretations like that into your essays is really important, because it will give you something to kind of argue with or argue against and make your interpretations a lot stronger. So always think about what possible interpretations can you get, and then what are your personal ideas on it as well. So the photographer didn't tremble when he was taking the photos, maybe because he's an expert or he's professional, but now when he's developing, his hands tremble. And maybe that's because finally he's starting to realize, the effect of what his job does. He's in rural England in the countryside, and it's very calm and peaceful. We have good weather here, which is debatable. It's one of those things, like I say, you can debate it either way. But what she means by good weather is kind of metaphorical. So there's no kind of significant violent disruptions in England typically. Well, there hasn't been for quite a long time. So we're quite privileged living in England, because we have this quite stable political situation. We don't have these kind of complex conflicts going on that are causing suffering and violence directly to people that we know. So unlike the countries, the weather is unlike the countries where he took the photographs, because the fields explode as children run through them away from conflict. So weather is sort of used here again as a metaphor for violence or instability versus stability. It's also a technique of pathetic fallacy that you can talk about there. Then we have a shift in focus to something very specific, which is a single photograph that starts to develop and process before his eyes. He sees a man and wife, and he remembers their story. He remembers that they were suffering, and he took a picture because someone must, which is an interesting thing if you analyze that, the photographer's opinion of his job or his attitude to his job. He figures someone's got to do it. So we have this idea that even though he didn't ask them directly if it's okay to document their pain, they kind of approved without words. So maybe he couldn't communicate properly with them. He didn't speak their language. Maybe they were in so much pain that it didn't seem appropriate. So it's kind of raising these ethical questions about, is it right what he did? do we have a right to know, or does he have a right to document their suffering? Especially if we can't make a difference to their situation, we can't help directly. The final line references the image of blood, and it's really unclear, again, deliberately, what that is speaking about. Is it the blood of the couple, the blood of other people that they're kind of covered in? And then eventually you have this idea as well of blood-stained earth in the aftermath of war. So just reminding us that blood is kind of symbolic of violence, really, and that this is this cultural idea that there's violence in the center of any kind of war situation. So then from the personal and individual, we switch back to 100 agonies. So we zoom out and we're like, this is one personal situation, and now times that by hundreds and thousands of people that are all in a similar position, and we don't know their names and we can't help them. And the photographer's documented all of these people. So we realize that this is just one small example, and she's trying to get us to amplify that and understand that on a large scale, which is very difficult to do. The photographer picks out which images he's going to send to his editor, and then the editor, who is the person who kind of picks and chooses what goes in the newspaper, has to select only a few of the images to actually make it to the supplement. And then finally, when the reader reads this supplement, we finally might be a bit sad for a little while we look at these images, but that's in between taking a bath and going for a beer with friends. So it's not got this lasting impact on our lives. We're left with a final image of the photographer who's kind of emotionless, and he stares out of the airplane and he's on his way to do his job again somewhere, and we don't know where he's going. And we know that he's taking photographs for money. So it's quite a sort of sarcastic and ironic ending. It's obviously got this kind of bitterness underlying it, like there's something wrong here. So it's trying to make us question the way that we consume news and media, the way that we engage with conflict and war. And I feel like it's very effective in doing that. So we're going to just go really quickly through a few key features of this poem now. There will be a lot more in this document than I'm actually able to talk about in the lesson, just for time purposes. So feel free to download this from the Scribbly page, or just pause and kind of read through at your own time if you need as well. So the first thing, the speaker voice. We have a third person omniscient narrator. This is a really removed, distanced narrator who is not part of the story, not a character within the middle of the action, not the photographer himself. So we're seeing it again from this very distanced perspective, in the same way that the photographer is quite distant from his subject. We're also distant from the photographer. The other figures in the poem are also unnamed. So we don't know who the readers are, who the editor is, who the photographer is, the husband and wife in the photo. There's a lot of people here, but none of them are personal or specific. They're there to give a wider picture of society as a whole across the world, and how people in non-war-torn countries react to distant war. Distant war is a really key idea here. So not just war, but war that isn't happening right now where we are. As I was saying before, there's a kind of cynical tone, a bitter tone in the poem, where Duffy comments on the ironic and insensitive way that we consume media. So basically, instead of us being there and experiencing it directly, we only see a small proportion of what goes on, and we see that for a few seconds at most, and then we just move on with our daily lives. I feel like she's writing this in the 80s, and nowadays it's almost even quicker, because we just scroll, just double tap and scroll past whatever you see on your phone, and that's how you experience news. So it's even faster, the amount of information and the amount of time we're willing to give to something. So it makes us think about the ethics of war and war documentation. It's about how do we record and catalogue and communicate war, as much as it is about war itself. It's kind of more about that even, I think. It's about war documentation. The photographer is doing it for a living to make money. So it's kind of ironic. People are all dying, and he's just making a living off them. I think that living word, the word living, is loaded with irony there. So it should make us appreciate the comfort and stability of our lives. It should make us really understand how lucky we are to be in positions of privilege if we don't live in these types of countries and we don't directly get impacted by this kind of conflict. But it also makes us question how we consume information and try to widen our perspective a little bit, I think, is the purpose of this poem. To make us understand that there's a lot more going beyond whatever we might just read in the news very quickly in the morning and, ignore for the rest of the day. So a few language techniques then. I'm going to just talk about a couple that I think are really, really important, and they're sort of ones you can use in any essay. So feel free to go through all of them in your own time as well. I'll talk about the things that I think are maybe more difficult to understand and try and explain them for you in more detail. So as though this were a church is quite interesting. The dark room is compared to a church. And it makes us think of the religious and spiritual aspects of war. It makes us think about the way that media is kind of like a religion as well, and the way that we consume information, or the way that we're asked to engage with difficult questions in life. The media kind of performs that function for a lot of people, especially if people aren't religious. It almost becomes like the purpose of kind of religion traditionally is partly to get us to engage with wider, more complex and difficult ideas in the world, like why do humans suffer, or what causes suffering, or how can we fix problems. The media sort of does that, so newspapers fulfill that role in society as much as religion does. Or it depends on whether you're religious or not, but for many people it does. So it's a kind of quasi-religion, the media. And she's trying to get us to understand this, that it has a lot of power that people don't necessarily think about or are aware of. As the darkroom is a church, the simile becomes extended, and the photographer is like a priest. So he's like the main spokesperson for the topic of suffering. His things that he picks and chooses are what we get to finally see. They're what are communicated to the general public. So it's kind of exploring age-old questions really about evil and suffering, but also trying to modernize them and make us understand a bit more about how do we interact with these concepts in the modern world, and how are we provided with this type of information that makes us think this way. So yeah, it's a combination of age-old questions that no one can really answer, but that are completely worth thinking about and trying to fix. And then, yeah, this kind of idea of modern media and how that functions as well, and the combination of the two. This technique, holophrasis, I'll just put it on its own little thing. Holophrasis is an important thing. I was talking about this earlier, where she compresses these phrases, these locations. It's almost dizzying. It's really difficult, picture a city in Ireland, and then a city in the Middle East, and then a city in Asia. It's very difficult to do. So she's just kind of showing that there's this idea of general political and social turmoil that is almost the effects of war, the suffering of war is almost the same regardless of the cause of that individual war. So she's talking more about the general way that war causes suffering for humanity and the tragedy of that, rather than any specific location. Belfast, Beirut, and Phnom Penh have this, I don't know if I'm pronouncing Phnom Penh right actually, but they have this P and B sound, which is plosive. And that suggests violence and explosions, because to make a plosive sound, you have to physically explode air out of your mouth. So it's always used in quite a violent, energetic way, a plosive sound. So in some ways, it's kind of powerful that you can just say this word and it makes us think of this whole political event behind it, or this whole situation. But in another way, it's reductive. We're just compressing and reducing and creating kind of little snapshots that we can remember of this whole complex situation that is way beyond our capacity to understand. So we don't really respect or understand what went on in these places, but it's very difficult to actually be able to do that without being in the location yourself and firsthand experiencing it. So a few photographs in a newspaper is not really enough to, properly respect what's going on in these places. But that's all most of us ever experience of modern war, because we're so removed from it as well. So Duffy's aware that very few of her readers will have experienced war firsthand. And so she's trying to engage with what do we think of as war, or how do we engage with war in the modern world in a non-war-torn situation. I really like this metaphor of a half-formed ghost, because that's what physically that's how it looks as the image is developing, because it usually goes from white to black, and as it's going kind of black, all of the details of the person's face will appear. So they do look like a half-formed ghost. But also there's this idea of a ghost is, that their soul is sort of ripped from their body, and they're kind of destroyed, their personality and their character's destroyed. So there's this idea of the fact that the stress and fear and pressure that they're under as they live in conflict really destroys their personality and has this kind of very damaging effect on their character or their soul. The idea of half-formed as well suggests thoughts, the way that thoughts form. Like, he can only half remember who this person was, and he doesn't know their name, and he's already, taken hundreds of pictures since then of families like this. So the thought is only half-formed or half-developed in his mind, and it's starting to return as a memory. But at the same time, even for the photographer who has been there, it's so hard for him to actually engage in a complex way and in a detailed way with all of these different situations that he's experienced. It's quite sad, this one, isn't it? I've just realised as we're going through. So sorry if I'm depressing you, but I think it's important and it's really powerful. And sometimes sad things are worth sort of sticking with and dealing with. So thank you for bearing with me through this sad poem. Hopefully it's giving you tons of ideas of things you can say in essays, because that's always my aim with these lessons. So a couple of form and structure points just to finish off with then. There's a lot of short sentences as well as that holophrasis. So he has a job to do. It's kind of matter of fact. It's quite basic and simplistic. And again, that's reinforcing the idea that the photographer has this sense of an emotional, practical approach to his task. You have this idea of regularity of rhyme scheme and regularity of stanza length as well. So it's sestets, which is 6-line stanzas. It's an ABBACC rhyme scheme in each stanza. So it's repetitive and it's regular, which is really at odds with war, because war is chaotic and random. So there's this thing like, this chaotic, crazy war, and we have to figure out a way to communicate it. So we've got to package it down to this really simple, short, basic, controlled way that we feed the information to you. She's kind of trying to capture that whole process of how information gets filtered and then channeled and organized by the media, by the newspapers, and then we experience it in that really refined, ordered form, which is so different from what it is originally. And there's a lot of enjambement, which basically I felt as I was reading it through, have a look back at those instances, but basically quite often she tries to set up an expectation in the first line, and then after the enjambement, it kind of denies our expectation. So we kind of have hope, and then the hope gets destroyed. For example, 100 agonies in black and white. We're like, it's not like we're hoping exactly, but we're like, oh wow, we're trying to engage with this really difficult idea, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6. Oh wait, no, we're not going to actually learn about all of those hundreds of cases. We're just going to learn about a few of these people. So our expectation and our thoughts kind of want to go in one way, and then what the media actually gives us is sort of going in the other way. So I feel like it is quite a scathing criticism of media. I don't know if that's just because I don't really like media that much, so I kind of latch onto that aspect of the poem and I'm like, yeah, that's in this poem too. But I do feel like she intends it as well. So we've got some attitudes here, and feel free to kind of look through these in more detail. I've definitely picked these apart for you. But voyeurism is important. The idea that we're kind of almost enjoying the excitement of learning about something without actually being involved ourselves, and that it's kind of really a bit wrong that we do that with really serious situations such as war-torn, conflict type countries, or we look at other people suffering from such a removed perspective that it only slightly emotionally impacts us and then we move on. It's kind of about what it is to be human and how hard it is to empathize and relate to people from other countries or people from different backgrounds or people that we don't personally know and spend time with. She does suggest that we're moved and we might have tears, but even then, we just kind of move on with our days. So I feel like the poem is supposed to have positive effects, even though it's quite a negative, pessimistic poem. And one of the positive effects is to make us appreciate on a deeper level these global conflicts and how they work, and how all of these ideas that underpin them that we're not really exposed to just by reading about them in the news. Maybe we might want to donate time or money to charitable causes to help them more directly, rather than just reading about them and moving on. Another point is that war is so complex and large, and the reasons behind it, and the political stuff and the cultural stuff and the immediate chaos, all of that is so difficult. It's very difficult to pinpoint and fully understand. If you've ever studied history, you're probably aware of this idea, because in history you normally have to study at least one war and the reasons behind it. It's very complex, quite subjective and open to interpretation. And there's all these different factors that kind of clash and culminate in this outbreak of violence. I feel like this is very fundamental because of the religious aspects to the poem, even though Duffy herself is not religious, so that's an important context point to bear in mind. You have this idea that wars are an expression of evil in humans. So it's sort of an exploration of how does evil occur in the world and how does it keep coming back and keep going on. Surely we can move past the point where we need to be at war with each other. We're not tribal anymore, you might think. But then at the same time, there's still wars going on. So how does that occur? And she's kind of trying to explore how evil works and that kind of idea of what is evil and what is evil about human nature. In a way, we might think the photographer is sort of evil because he's able to distance himself. But then he also does a job that's very difficult, and not many of us would want to do that job, I don't think. So is he a noble figure that we should respect, or an evil figure that we should dislike? It's an interesting debate to be had there. So we have a lot more context on the wars here. Feel free to kind of pause and read about these if you find it useful. I found it useful actually, because I didn't even, while I was reading through, I had the effect of, I don't actually know enough about these different wars and conflicts. So I spent quite a long time reading about them. And I think that's a positive effect of the poem, really. But yeah, there's all these different places and contexts for the wars. So feel free to have a look through those if you feel like it'll be useful. You can use them more specifically in your analysis there as well, if you know more about them. And the poem was published finally in 1985. So 2 of these wars were still ongoing at the time, the Lebanese one, the Beirut, and the Belfast, the Northern Ireland conflict. And like I say, it's really interesting to contrast and compare 1985 with now when you're doing this poem. What is the similarities and differences between how we consume media now and how we consumed media before everything was digital and the internet was around? So the themes then, as I was saying at the beginning, and we've kind of come full circle, if you can get your head around the themes and the messages behind these themes, this is the way to unlock the poem and make you really good at analysing it. So spend some time now looking back over the poem, thinking about what we've discussed in this lesson, and see if you can come up with your own conclusions to what messages Duffy is trying to show us through the exploration of these themes. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully, even though it's not a positive lesson, it's been fun and enjoyable and kind of interesting and thought-provoking, and you feel like you definitely know this poem more and it's made you think more about the wider world as well. That was my intention for today, rather than just a nice fun lesson. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure I'll see you guys in another Scribbly lesson soon. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe so that you get a drip feed of these types of lessons. Thanks, and bye for now.